Hello everybody and welcome to our discussion of genetics and just sort of an introduction to axolotls in general. You should find this worksheet associated with this and be able to answer the questions as we march on through. So welcome to Axes and welcome to a brief introduction to genetics as we go forward. So when I was in college, I took a course, an introduction to education course, and one of the first things our professor had us write was sort of a philosophy of education paper. And on my philosophy of education paper here, written back in 2003, I noted that some topics stood out, like the California Gold Rush, Macbeth, and Mendel's peas. And my professor here highlighted Mendel's peas and said, "What's this?" Now, to me, that's just not okay, because everybody should know who Mendel is, and especially a professor at the University of Nevada. And Mendel, to me, is like knowing who Shakespeare is or who Macbeth is or something on those lines. So I was frustrated by this, and I swore at that moment that every student I ever had going forward would know who Mendel was. So, who was Mendel and what was his gigantic contribution to biology? Mendel was an Austrian monk born in 1822. So he was sort of a contemporary of Charles Darwin, even though they never met. They both contributed a lot to our understanding of biology. And Mendel is famous for working with these pea plants. This picture here shows him fertilizing some peas with pollen from other ones. And he made around 29,000 crosses of pea plants and observed the similarities and differences between them and their parents. So if he had two purple-flowered plants, did they end up with purple-flowered offspring or white? And same with size and color of the pods and all of these other variables. And he spent so much time making observations that based on those observations, he was able to develop some pretty sound inferences about inheritance, when things did and didn't look like the previous generation. And because of this, we sort of herald him as the father of genetics, and we talk about his contributions in a really positive light these days. Mendelian genetics is sort of your baseline genetics 1.0. So understanding his contributions to me is really important. He didn't get much credit until after he died, but he still nowadays is heralded as one of the leaders of modern biology. And so how are we going to remember him? Well, we're going to do similar stuff. In class, we're going to repeat some of his processes with our salamanders and answer several questions. The first question, we're going to look at the offspring and we're going to look at the parents, and we're going to see how they're similar and different from one another. Do the offspring look just like the parents, or is there some variation there? And we're going to try to figure out at least what we have in front of us and make those observations. Then we're going to use Mendel's findings to help us discuss why we do or don't see things that look just like their parents. And we'll learn how Mendel figured all this stuff out, and we'll put it all together in one big picture towards the middle end of the unit. And then finally, we'll end up our unit talking about how some of our understanding has changed since Mendel. Obviously, he's more than 100 years ago that he came up with these discoveries. How have things changed since then? So some of that, for those of you in honors biology, will be through our discussion of genome, but we'll have a few class discussions too. So in order to talk about any of this, again, we're going to be doing this with axolotls, and my assumption is you don't know a ton about axolotls, and that's okay. But in order to really get this thing going, we need to make sure you at least understand what the little buggers are. So if we understand a bit about axolotls, it's going to make a much more fruitful discussion for us. So here's a picture I took about a year and a half ago of some of my axolotls. I've been breeding axolotls for almost 10 years now, mostly to teach genetics, but also a little bit on the side after that. So I know a lot about them. I think they're really, really neat and they're fun, and they're a good way to teach genetics because they show some of the same characteristics that Mendel saw in pea plants. But to begin with, axolotls are amphibians. They are a type of salamander from the class Amphibia. So they're animals and chordates, just like us, animals with backbones, but they belong to the class Amphibia. We belong to the class Mammalia, so there's some differences there. To begin with, amphibians almost always have two life stages, the larval stages, then some type of metamorphosis, and then an adult stage. They also have pretty slimy skin, and all amphibians are carnivorous as adults, which is kind of unique to vertebrates. Everybody else has at least some vegetarian. Well, chondrichthyes or sharks also have nothing but predators, but most other groups have some herbivorous adults. Most amphibians have their larval stage that's in the water and their adults on land, hence the term amphibian or amphibious. Axolotls are a bit of an exception to this, and we'll get to that in particular later. So what are axolotls? Again, they're amphibians. Amphibians can be really grouped into three separate groups. The one on the far right here is caecilians, are these blind, limbless, worm-like things that live in the tropics. We're not going to focus on them. The two groups that are widespread throughout the world are frogs and salamanders. And the big difference is frogs don't have tails, but salamanders do. Salamanders belong to a group called Chordata, which in Latin actually means tail, like a caudal fin on a fish. This here's a picture of a newt, which is a type of salamander. Just like a toad is a type of frog or a gull is a type of bird, newts are a type of salamander, and so are axolotls. But salamanders have tails. Frog larvae are herbivorous, whereas salamanders are carnivorous. So salamanders are carnivorous their entire lives, frogs only as adults. And salamanders have a very unique form of reproduction, which we'll get to a little bit later. Those are the big differences between these groups. So axolotls in particular are a type of salamander native to an area near Mexico City. About 500 years ago, there was a giant lake there, Lake Texcoco, and this lake was isolated from fishes, and so there were axolotls able to evolve in a fishless environment here, and so that's where they did, and they were all over this lake. In the last 500 years, though, we've of course built a really big city there. Most of the lake is gone, and axolotls are only found in some tiny little canals down in the south end of what was once their historic range. They may not even be there at all anymore. There's a group trying to get them reintroduced, but because the habitat is so much smaller, it's polluted, and they're introduced fish, it's been really hard for axolotls in the wild. That said, there are plenty of axolotls in the pet trade and in research labs, just not that many in the wild. So as far as characteristics, axolotls are a tiger salamander. It's the family Ambostomatidae, and they're even the genus Ambostoma, much like these tiger salamanders here. These are California tiger salamanders, but tiger salamanders are found throughout most of the United States, with a few exceptions, including Nevada. But they're really, really neat critters that transition into normal adults that live on land. Now, axolotls are different. They don't do this. They stay in the water their entire life. They're sort of the Peter Pan of salamanders. Normal salamanders go through this life cycle where as the eggs hatch, they're a larval stage that lives in the water. From there, they start to develop first forelimbs and then hind limbs. And then eventually they go through a big metamorphosis where they lose their gills, their tail flattens out, and they develop into terrestrial adults. Axolotls don't do this. They stop partway through this development and stay in the water. They're sort of Peter Pan-like because they never grow up. So, a unique characteristic, axolotls stay in the water as adults. They essentially look like baby salamanders as adults. They develop reproductive organs and all that, but they stay in the water and look like babies. Another thing like that's crazy about axolotls is a lot like Deadpool in the Marvel Comics. Deadpool is able to regenerate limbs. Axolotls can actually do the same thing. Here's an axolotl I had a few years ago. This axolotl didn't make it, unfortunately, but at some point in its development, it had its right arm bit off by one of its siblings. And you can see there it's working its way on back. And axolotls are amazing in their ability to regenerate. They can regenerate limbs, tails, parts of organs. They're super exceptional with regards to this. Some studies have been conducted with potential applications to human amputees. Maybe at some point we could actually get axolotl genes into humans. There's also potential for fighting heart disease and other really important diseases for humans. And we've learned all this stuff with axolotls. So crazy cool creatures. Google it. Look online. You can learn a lot about the little buggers. That said, our focus is going to be on genetics. So let's talk specifically about terms and ideas associated with genetics. So to begin with, a characteristic is a feature of an organism that can have different values. So for example, something like hair color can have a variety of different values. You can have blonde hair, brown hair, black hair, red hair, pink hair, you name it. All of those are different values for the characteristic of hair color. Skin color, height, number of toes, all these things are characteristics. Traits is the term we use for an option or a value for one of those characteristics. So blonde hair, brown hair, red hair are all traits for the characteristic of hair color. Though we're not going to get into this too much today, a term that Mendel developed is alleles. And alleles are the sets of genetic instructions that give you those traits. Since sexually reproducing organisms have 2 copies of each allele, sometimes the trait that they show for their characteristic is different. And we'll spend some time getting into that in a few weeks. We can also break down characteristics into heritable and non-heritable characteristics. Heritable characteristics are ones that are passed from one generation to the next genetically, like eye color. Unless you're wearing weird contact lenses, your eye color you inherited from your parents. Some combination of their alleles contribute to your trait for the characteristic of eye color. Number of toes, clearly something that's also genetic, unless in case you lose one. Most people have only 5 toes per limb. Some people have 6. Axolotls have 4 on their front limbs and 5 on their hind limbs. These are all heritable characteristics. Some things are a little bit more complicated than just heritable or not. Intelligence seems to have a heritable component, but maybe there's something environmental and developmental there too. It's not quite as clear as eye color and number of toes, but nearly all of our traits at least have some genetic component. There are, however, of course, some things that are not heritable. Non-heritable characteristics like hair length, which is determined not by your genes, but how often you go to the barber, or number of tattoos, like this beautiful Mendel Tribute P tattoo. All of these are non-heritable. This woman, despite her wonderful tattoo, will not now have babies with Mendel tattoos. It's not heritable. It's not something she'll pass on. And again, much like intelligence, there's some characteristics where it's not quite clear. Is it heritable or not? What's the relationship between environment and genetics? There's a great amount of debate on this, and there's hopefully more and more coming to light over the next few decades. When we talk about what we actually look like, the word we use for that is phenotype. Phenotype is what an organism actually looks like or behaves like, the outward traits it displays for its characteristics. Your genotype is what informs your phenotype. So the genotype is the set of instructions that makes you the way you are, that makes you have blue eyes or blonde hair or a high level of computational math intelligence or whatever it is. All of those things are based on the alleles that you have in your genotype. We will spend a lot of time later on talking about genotypes, but our focus today is really going to be understanding axolotl phenotypes. In other words, what they look like, especially in terms of the characteristic of body color. We're really going to focus on that and the different phenotypes that axolotls can have for the characteristic of body color. So to begin with, they vary in what their body color is. A normal axolotl, much like this one here, it has the ability to make black coloring, which makes it dark to blend in with its environment, and also this goldish coloring or flecking. In the pet trade, this is called a starburst wild type, but it is a wild type axolotl. These guys are very similar to what the axolotls would have looked like at the bottom of those canals in Mexico City or in the lake 500 years ago. So wild type axolotls are what they would look like in the wild. The reason axolotls look the way they do is because of a combination of alleles that give them these traits. We're going to go over 4 of these. There are lots of them out there, but we're going to go over 4 in some detail. To begin with, the ability to make melanin is based on whether or not you have melanophores, and if you have the genes that allow you to make dark coloring. Axolotls that have this show some darkness somewhere on their body. Axolotls that can't end up being at least partially, if not completely, albino. So again, melanophores, the ability to make melanin. Similarly, there's another color that we see, that kind of goldish, yellow, shiny pigment that is iridophores. Some axolotls can and some axolotls cannot make iridophores. So there's variation there as well. There's also variation on where the colors can go. Leucistic axolotls can make melanin or other colors, but it's not distributed to the normal places on their body. So maybe it's just found around the head or the eyes, but it's not distributed to the rest of the body. And finally, the last gene that we'll talk about is the green fluorescent protein gene. This is a gene that was genetically engineered and removed from jellyfish and put in axolotls and other organisms that make them glow greenish under a black light. We've used it for a marker for genetic testing. It's actually a pretty useful thing The scientist who did it received the Nobel Prize, but for our purposes, it makes them glow, and it's kind of... When we look at the different types of axolotls, we'll start by talking about a combination of those first two things, melanophores and iridophores. Wild-type axolotls can, like we said before, make both melanin and iridophores. That's why they appear dark with the gold flecking. So for their phenotype, you would call them a wild type, but for description, you would say that they're able to make both black and gold. You could also imagine an axolotl that can't do either of these, can't make black and can't make gold. One that can't make either of these would be devoid of color and would be an albino. And an albino axolotl can't make black and can't make gold, and they show up really white like this. The only reason they appear red is because of the blood in their gills appears red. They can't make color otherwise. Well, you can also imagine an axolotl that could make one but not the other. For example, a golden albino axolotl can make gold but not melanin, or can make gold but not black. So they appear this beautiful goldish color, which is clearly different than a straight white albino. You can also imagine an axolotl that can't make gold but can make black. We call those melanistics. Melanistic axolotls can't make gold, so appear completely black. The one here on the left is a true melanistic, very, very dark in color. The one on the bottom is also a melanistic. Even though it's lighter in color, in the pet trade, some people call these lavender melanistics, it still just doesn't make that gold, which is why it's a melanistic axolotl. Now, so those are the main four, but leucism talks to us about where that melanin or where those iridophores go. A leucistic axolotl can make melanin. Notice this axolotl has black in its eyes. It's capable of making melanin. It's just not distributed throughout the rest of the body of the axolotl like a normal one would be. So leucistic axolotls can make their colors, they just don't distribute it right. It stays around their heads. And in this case, a pure leucistic like this, it's all in the eyes. Here's some pictures of axolotls that can make iridophores, but they don't distribute throughout their bodies. So these are likely leucistic golden albinos. So the gold you can see kind of clumped up on their heads is not distributed through the rest of their bodies, which is why we see them the way that we do. And finally, GFPs. GFPs, again, these are pictures taken under a blacklight of a leucistic GFP as well as a wild-type GFP. These guys can make their own body colors, but in addition to that, they glow under a blacklight, which is pretty cool stuff. And again, that gene comes from jellyfish. Another thing to talk about is the gender of axolotls. So this beautiful wild type is a male axolotl. How we know it's a male is it has a swollen cloaca. Axolotls don't have penises and vaginas. They have a sort of vagina-like slit, whether they're male or female. The males, in addition to having that cloaca or that slit, have a little bit of a box behind their hind limbs. In general, they're thinner overall than females, but they also have this nice big box behind their hind limbs. This doesn't show up until the axolotl's 5 or 6 inches long and about that same number of months. But again, it tells you whether or not they're male. Females lack that box, and they also tend to be a little bit fatter in general. So female axolotl is fatter, males skinnier with the box. So how salamanders reproduce is actually super interesting. And I want to take a quick aside to talk about fertilization. When organisms engage in sexual reproduction, they got to share their genetic information. So the male haploid cells or gametes need to combine with the female haploid cells or gametes. There are a couple of different ways to do this. Sort of the traditional or the ancestral way of doing this is external fertilization, where the female lays her eggs out into the open, usually in water, and the male then sprays his sperm outside the body of the female. Now, this works. Many species do it, lots of fish, frogs, and so on. But it really does have some disadvantages. To begin with, it needs to happen in water. And if you want to invade land and be a terrestrial creature, you don't want to be stuck breeding in water all the time. Lots of sperm don't get to the eggs, especially in fast-flowing streams. Some of that sperm from the male is going to go other places. Predation is an issue. There's also issues of lack of development. You have to lay eggs really early in their development before the male haploid even joins with them. And so you can't nurture and raise up those eggs very easily. And also multiple males can come in and fertilize the same group of eggs. And so there are some disadvantages with this. And this is why, over and over again, we've seen the evolution of internal fertilization. So internal fertilization happens when, in the case of these lizards, their two cloacas come together and the male shoots his sperm directly into the female. This is, of course, how we do it. Male humans have penises and the sperm goes directly into the female. Fertilization happens inside the body of the female. Now, axolotls do internal fertilization, but all salamanders have a very weird way of doing this. What the males will do, they have these little mounds of jelly called spermatophores. And these little spermatophores, the females will come up and pick them up if they're interested in reproducing with those males. So the male will lay the mound of jelly, the female will come around, and if she's interested, she'll squat down and pick them up and reproduce. A couple of days later, she'll start laying a whole bunch of eggs. How many eggs? Well, females lay somewhere between 100, 600 eggs, depending on her size and age. Some get well up to 1,000, but they lay lots and lots of these eggs, like this picture of Lucy doing it here. She'll attempt to attach the eggs to vegetation or whatever else is available, or just lay them on the bottom if nothing's available to her. Once those eggs are laid, it takes them about 10 to 14 days, sometimes a little longer, in order to develop to where they can hatch out. They start out in the eggs, they end up starting to cleave a little bit after a few days, and within about 2 weeks, they'll hatch out as these little heads with gills on them and a tail. They still don't have any limbs, but they're able to feed, and within a couple of days, they start munching down on brine shrimp or whatever is available to them. So the very last topic I want to talk about, because it's weird for us to see something like axolotls where they don't do much to take care of their babies. We humans are what we call a case-selected species. We put a lot of energy into a very small amount of young. I recently just had a kid of my own, and my kid spent 9 months inside my wife, and now we're going to take care of the darn thing for the next 20 years. That's an incredible amount of parental care. No other species spends that much time raising their young. This is called a case-selected reproductive strategy, and is typical of mammals, and specifically really large mammals, to have few young, lots of parental care, and tend to live relatively long lives. There's some birds that are very case-selected. You can even think of some plants that are kind of case-selected, like an avocado, where that avocado pit has a lot of nutrients available to the new avocado that hopefully will grow into a new tree. Case-selected species, again, lots of investment in very small numbers of young. There are some frog species that do this, where they lay a few eggs and then they actually carry their tadpoles around in the canopy. There's so many different species that exhibit this type of strategy. In contrast, though, we have R-selected species. R-selected species sort of do everything in the opposite. They have lots and lots of babies and don't do much for them at all. Axolotls are R-selected. They lay lots of babies and there's no parental care after they lay them. I guess the best you get is the mother attaches them to vegetation so they don't get swept away. But after that, you're on your own. There are lots of species that do this. Again, it's called an R-selected strategy. Some other species that do this, spiders like the one pictured here. A classic is sea turtles, where they lay their eggs and then leave, and the eggs, the little babies have to get down to the ocean. You can think of all mushrooms and ferns that have spores as a means of reproducing, where these spores have basically genetic information and that's it. They have to land in exactly the right spot to reproduce. Okay, that's it. I think that gives you sort of an introduction to axolotls, as well as a couple of differences in reproductive strategies and fertilization. Hope you're ready to go when we start talking about genetics going forward.